If you'll take your Bibles and turn to Judges chapter 16, we're coming to the end of our series pretty soon on Judges, and specifically on Samson. His life is one dramatic tragedy after another. Here is a man who, for the most part, as I've heard from many of the community groups thus far, when you've discussed the sermon series in the community groups, you pretty much conclude that Samson is in all of us, isn't he? We find so much of what Samson does and how he does it and his spiritual journey, his spiritual roller coaster, as pretty much typical of where most of us are. We differ in what our sin patterns are, but nonetheless, I think you can find yourself somewhere in the life of Samson. I've entitled this message this morning, Spiritual Depression. Depression is a very interesting and very debatable type of thing. Some people would almost insist that it be called a disease, similar to cancer or heart disease or something of that nature, and certainly there is something to be said about that. There is functional depression that is the direct result of organic imbalances that people have inside of their bodies. Sometimes science can't explain these. They just know that certain medications seem to correct the problem. And I am not one who believes that all depression is organically based. However, there is some depression that is organically based. And I think we would be unwise not to see that. Some people have imbalances. Some people have chemical shortages or imbalances in one way or another. There's material across which nerve endings must travel. For some people, that material does not get produced. And so one nerve tells the other nerve something and it doesn't listen. And as the result of that, people have what I like to refer to as organic depression. Some of that depression can become to the point where you are functionless. And functional depression is a very, very dark place to be. And some of you have been there. Some of you don't know why. Most doctors will not tell you this is what organically is wrong, because there are no real serious tests that can determine to what degree a chemical imbalance exists in your body. Now, I'm saying that to you because I don't want you to, as we preach this message, think that I don't believe that there is such a basis for depression, that there's an organic cause in some cases for depression. However, in most cases, most forms of depression, I believe, are more spiritual than they are organic. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that you do not have, or some do not have, a basis for claiming the disease aspect of depression. And I wouldn't want anyone to walk out of here saying that all depression is the result of some sort of sin pattern in your life, because I don't believe that. But I do believe that there is a overwhelming majority of depressions that people go through that are the direct result of patterns of sin whereby we respond in a certain way and we move on, and we've learned or conditioned ourselves to respond that way, and habits are formed that lead us right down this spiritual cycle. Now let me see if I can illustrate that to you. Let me see if I can paint a picture for you. If I had a chalkboard up here, I'd be able to show you exactly what I'm talking about. You're moving along in your life. You're traveling along a path in your life. Let's call it the timeline of your life. And you're moving and things are all hunky-dory and you're doing well, or seem to be doing well. Then all of a sudden there is an invasion, whether it's some sort of conflict or crisis or opportunity or temptation. You can almost fill in the blank as to what that kind of invasion might be. It might even be a divine invasion where God tests you for some reason. And you're moving along and you come to, well, we'll call it a point X right here. My life was moving along from over there to here, quite normal. Everything was going well. And now I'm faced with a point X. And I have choices to make at that point. I have moral choices to make if there's a temptation. I have personal choices to make if there's some sort of test. But I have a choice to make. I can either use that test or that temptation in my life to proceed to a higher level of spiritual maturity, or I can fail that test and proceed to a lower level of spiritual maturity. So if you can imagine two lines, one above me and one below me, I'm walking along this pattern, and then I have the opportunity to graduate or to mature spiritually to a higher level, or I have the opportunity to fail and go to a lower level. Now, what we've noticed in Samson's case is he continually made the wrong choices, didn't he? He continually is going along a certain way. Now, let's go all the way back to the beginning where Samson sees this woman in Timnah. His eyes are beholding a woman he had no business being with. So his eyes are now tempting him. He is now tested and tempted, and he failed that test. He insisted with his parents, I want that woman. So he came to his point X, and rather than graduating and seeing that his eyes were deceiving him, he chose to fail. And now he's on this level. He was on this level. He could have been on this level. You following me? Shake your heads, yes. Okay. So he chose to go to a lower level. Now he's moving along, he's trucking along at this lower level, and he comes now to a point Y in his life. Now remember, he was up here, now he's down here. He could have been way up here, but now he's way down here. And so he's moving along, and he sees another opportunity. We've studied all of this together over the past few weeks. Samson continued to make the wrong choices, didn't he? So he comes along to the point where he is now given the opportunity to make another moral choice along the way. And you can fill in the blanks. I don't want to have to review the whole sermon series, or pick up the tapes and you'll figure it out. But now he's over here at a point Y. This time it's with Delilah. He's all the way down here now. He could have been up there. He is way down here. He used to be right over here. But now, since he's established the pattern with his eyes all the way back here with the woman at Timnah, we find him just before Delilah, just before he meets Delilah. Where does he go? He goes, and the Bible simply tells us he went into a prostitute. Again, another woman not named. The only woman named that Samson had any dealings with is Delilah. Even his mother's not named. So the Bible is trying to tell us he had a woman problem. He had a lust problem. He had an eyes problem. So he starts out with the woman at Timnah. All kinds of stuff happens as the result of that. He's walking now at a lower level. Then we read, all of a sudden, the Bible opens these pages. I think it's the 15th chapter or so. He went into a prostitute. And the men are laying in wait for him, and he breaks down the gates. He takes the gates and carries them up to Hebron. All that big scene that takes place. But now, at that point Y, where he had the opportunity when face to face with the prospects of going into that prostitute, he could have said, you know what, I'm not going to do this. This is not the right thing for me to do. God doesn't want me with a prostitute. He wants me to marry a woman from the heritage of the covenant community. My parents were right. That's what he should have said. But now remember, all the way back here at Timnah, he made a choice, didn't he? And now the pattern was established. We now have a pattern. And when he comes over here to this point Y with the prostitute, again, he's faced with a moral choice. He could have chosen victory, and he could have risen to the level where he was before he met the woman at Timnah. But he's already established the pattern. So instead of making the moral choice to get back to where he used to be before Timnah, He makes the same moral choice because the pattern's been established to go into the prostitute, and now he's at a even lower level. You following me? And then when he finally meets Delilah, literally all hell breaks loose in his life, because what he didn't learn at Timnah, what he didn't learn with the prostitute, he didn't learn with Delilah, and each time along the way, as Samson is making these moral choices, there is a downward spiral. That downward spiral is called spiritual depression. And he's all the way down here now. You're going to see him with his eyes gouged out in just a minute. He's all the way down here. He can't even see where he used to be. He's nowhere near the man he used to be. You don't even recognize him anymore. People walking by would have said, "This is Samson? This is what we're supposed to be fearing? This is the man whose strength, the strength of the Lord belongs to this man? This is the Samson you're talking about?" So what we have here is a series of moral choices that span almost 20 years. Now, the Bible gives you, 3 chapters? But those 3 chapters cover about 20 years of Samson's life. So you have to kind of fill in the details and imagine what his social life must have been like. I believe he spent a lot of time in Timnah. I believe he was raised as a young man so close to Timnah that most of the opportunities that he took to socialize were with the Philistines. He established patterns as a little boy, and those patterns were never broken. So that by the time we have a picture of Samson at the end of chapter 16, grinding at the wheel of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, we have his eyes plucked out of his head, and we have his strength completely gone. That, to me, is a picture of true spiritual depression, as the direct result of following for years patterns of sin. You know, we like to put a label on depression. We like to have a pill that fixes it. And in some cases, as I said earlier, there is an organic basis. But in most cases, I can't put a percentage on it, but I can just tell you from my own personal experience of having counseled people for 43 years, from my own experience, probably 10%, maybe as much as 15 or 20% of those who come in who are depressed because of organic problems. Now, here's another thing to consider. You can start out with a sin pattern-based depression that I'm describing to you that becomes organic in nature. In other words, you can end up organically depressed, chemically lost, chemically imbalanced as the result of the stress on your system because of the bad choices you make. So there is a basis even to look at those who are chemically depressed and ask yourself at least this question: what is the basis for that depression? Now, I think Jesus made this very clear when this young man, when the disciples came across this young man, or this man, we don't know whether he was young, who was blind. And his disciples said, "Lord, who sinned that this man is born blind? Did he sin, or did his parents sin?" They even raised the question that most Jews at that time believed if you were blind, or if you had some disease, or if you were a leper of some sort, it had to be because either you sinned or your parents sinned. They believed that. And Jesus said, neither one. But that the glory of God might be revealed, he heals the man, and we have that great miracle of the healing of the blind man. What he's telling us there is not all problems are the direct result of sin, but there are some problems, many problems, including spiritual depression, and certainly in the case of Samson, that is the direct result of a continuance of patterns that can go back for years. You can go back with some who are spiritually depressed for years, and you can see that there is a basis, at least in the patterns in which sin or temptation or crisis have been handled. And there's a third form of spiritual depression. You got the organically based, you got the sin pattern based, but there's a third form, which is simply oppression, where you're being set up. Satan is setting you up. He's luring you into believing certain things about yourself or about your life situation or about other people, and he fills your mind with things, let's call it garbage, and you can't figure out what is really the truth and what's really the garbage. We'll simply call it satanic oppression. And I believe there are people who do become depressed as the result of spiritual and demonic oppression. Now, I'm sure there are a variety of other forms, but these are the ones I want to focus on today because, you see, there's an extreme danger in, well, we'll call it faulty self-confidence. This is what we find in Samson. As you listen to the man talk, and it's intriguing to me that the Bible has recorded for us certain words that came out of Samson's mouth. We have a 40-year period of Samson's life, and he speaks only a handful of times. And in that handful of times, the Holy Spirit chose to pen certain words that will give us insight into principles and precepts that we can learn from Samson. That's why the story's there, because Samson's in all of us. Every single one of us sitting here has a Samson complex. And part of it, or a large part of it, I should say, usually starts, and we get into extreme danger with what I like to call faulty self-confidence. Samson was a picture of this. He keeps talking about his strength, his strength, his strength. And even in the story where he's with Delilah and she tempts him 3 times, and 3 times she says, the Philistines are upon you, etc., etc. When he finally tells her the truth, the Bible tells us she saw that he was telling the truth. And my challenge to you last week was, well, what did she see? What did she actually see? And we'll see that in just a moment. Now, the Bible also tells us that humility is the key to greatness. You want to be great? Humble yourself. He that shall be greatest among you is the one who will be what? Humble. Humble. Humility and servanthood are the key to greatness. Now, humility is almost the direct opposite of self-confidence. Now, I'm going to say something more about self-confidence because there is a right place for self-confidence, but most people don't get this. The moment that presumption takes the place of humility, the danger to your soul really gets high charged. The moment you get to the point where you presume certain things about either your gifts, talents, and abilities, or about what God is going to do with the decision or the action you're about to take, presumptuous grace, that is the moment where our soul, I believe, is in the greatest danger. Now, by humility, I do not mean that we are to minimize God-given gifts. God gave you gifts. He gave you certain abilities. He gives us certain strengths. Now, those gifts and those abilities and those strengths are given to us for a reason. And you must value what God has given you. You must value the strengths He has given you. Samson was given great strength, raised as a Nazirite. At least as we watch his life unfold, he, one by one, disrobes himself and disarms the aspects of the Nazirite vow to the point where he ends up with his eyes plucked out, grinding at the mill, because he did not value what God had given him. Samson did not overrate his strength when he submitted to be bound by the men of Judah, nor when he put the gates, remember he ripped the gates out of Gath and took the gates on his shoulders and carried them over to the hill against Hebron. He wasn't minimizing his strength. The transition to presumption commences as soon as we forget and we see this in Samson, that we have nothing, strengths, talents, abilities, nothing that we have not received. Not earned, not deserved, nor are they inherent. Your strengths, your talents, your abilities, what we might translate today in a secular vernacular as self-confidence or self-image, which I believe can be very sinful. Whatever you have in the way of strengths and talents and abilities are gifts. They were given to you. You receive them in the same way that a baby receives life. What child chooses to be born? It is something that is done to them, not because of them. That's why when Jesus said you must be born again, the verb is a passive verb, which indicates it is something done to you. You don't become born again. You are made born again. It is a new birth that God gives to you. Same thing with your talents, your gifts, and your abilities. You know, you watch some people, you watch some athletes, and you hear the expression again and again, don't you? Man, they were born that way. There's a lot of truth to that. Have you seen musicians who are just kids that are just brilliant? They don't take the 10, 15, 20 years of lessons. They take the 1 or 2, and they got it. Well, they're born with that. It's not something they earned. It's not something they deserved. How about the kid that scores the 1600 on the SATs? I hated those kids. 1600s, perfect scores. You can't even miss one? You can't miss one? You know, I was watching our son play yesterday at the memorial service for Isabella, and I leaned over to his mother and I said, "Where did he get that from?" And in her true humble spirit, she said, "Well, from me." Now, her exact words were, "I have no idea. I have no idea. I know he worked very hard, but there's a lot of it's inborn. There's a lot of natural, but it's given to you." And when we begin to make the transition to presuming upon those gifts, we presume on God continuing to supply strength through those gifts and talents as though we owned them, regardless of the use that we make of them. It's what you gave me, Lord, and I can use it in any way I so choose. Nothing could be further from the truth. If God gave you a gift or talent or ability, He gave it to you to use for His purposes as He defines them day by day, moment by moment in your life. It's the moment you say, "I'll do with these what I please," that we begin to presume. We then begin to believe that it really doesn't matter how we use our strengths and our gifts and our talents and our abilities. And it's only a matter of time that we begin to use them for our own glorification. It becomes all about us and not about how we might bring glory and honor to God. I remember talking to a relative once who was very prosperous in a very prosperous part of the country, very successful at his work, and yet a heathen to the core. And I remember visiting this relative, and I remember looking, I can still see the picture. I looked into his eyes and I said, "God has really blessed you." And I'll never forget what I saw in his eyes. I saw a hollowness in his eyes at that point, and then that hollowness came out in the words. He said, "What's God have to do with this? Everything I have, I earned." And I remember what I said back to him. I said, "Now you need to be very careful, because you've just crossed the line. And God, who gave it to you, can just as quickly take it away." Within 3 months, he was bankrupt. Lost it all. So you see, the moment we begin to use what God gave us for our own use, for our own glorification, we've crossed a line. We are secure, a false security, that God's going to continue to supply the gifts and the strength and provide us with everything we need, no matter how much we abuse what he's given us. That's Samson. That's Samson. Now you have Judges chapter 16. Look with me beginning with verse 15. Let's review this once more. Here's a man running on empty. I remember, well, let me read this passage. Judges 16, verse 15. Then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me?" Now, by the way, Samson loved her, but there's nowhere that indicates that she loved him. Here's a man who has crossed the line. Remember Timnah? Remember the prostitute? Now he's with Delilah, and the sin pattern of spiritual depression has run its full course. You're about to watch a guy running on empty. He has nothing left in the container. This is the third time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day. Notice how coarse the scriptures are here. Notice how the author of scripture is driving home a point. Nagging. That's the word that's used. Nagging. Prodding. With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. She told him everything. So he told her everything. No razor has ever been used on my head. Now keep in mind something. All the way back at Timnah, there are three aspects of the Nazirite vow he was required to keep. No drinking, no touching unclean or dead things, and the locks on his head are never to be shaven. Three things. All the way back at Timnah, we find him partying at his bachelor party, going through the grapevines, and drinking his little heart out. So he's already cut off half of the vow, or a third of the vow. Then he kills 30 people in Ascalon in order to satisfy his gambling debt, and he strips their dead bodies of their clothing so that he can pay the gambling debt for the little riddle that was done at his bachelor party. We talked about that in previous sermons. Now 2/3 of the Nazirite vow have been compromised. But now here's the third one. And you know, it's amazing God didn't kill him up to this point. God could have killed him up to this point. You know, God does kill people. The Bible tells us that when Moses refused to circumcise his child, it says God sought to kill him. This is before Moses became Moses. You know, the Moses we know. This is Moses at a junction in his life where he refuses to circumcise his child. His wife Zipporah actually comes, grabs the knife, and in anger she circumcises the child. But the Bible tells us, very interesting comment, God sought to kill Moses. Imagine that. God sought to kill Moses. It's a wonder he didn't seek to kill Samson. He tells the whole story. He lets Samson's life run its miserable spiritual depression course so that we can get a good, hard look at how choices can affect everything in our life. So it says in verse 17, so he told her everything. No razor has ever been used on my head. Remember the other three temptations that she threw at him? It talks about, don't wear, if you bind me with certain ropes and you bind me with certain cords, etc. And he's playing a game with her. Now, by the way, there's every indication that in the secular worship of Dagon, there were sexual rites and practices that involved some of the stuff that he was playing with here. He was toying with it. I won't go into detail. Suffice it to say, it's pretty perverted. But notice on the last one, before she hears the truth from him, on the very last temptation, he says something about weaving his hair. Now he's taken her from what you tie me with and what you bind me with to the hair. His strength, by the way, friends, was not in his hair. So don't grow your hair long thinking you're going to be Samson. You're not going to be Samson. It had nothing to do with his hair. It's what that hair represented. It represented a covenant vow. A sacred, 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 sacred vow. He had already dumped 2/3 of that vow. Now he's coming to the very last one, and he's playing with her. And he talks about weaving his hair in the loom. So he's brought her to the source without her even knowing it. Well, that failed. And then she throws the love thing on him. I thought you loved me. And she goes after him day after day after. Now, we don't know how long that went on. That could have gone on for a long, long time. Could have gone on, I don't know, could have gone on for years. But at some point along the way, he'd had enough. It says there, he was sick to death of it. And then he says to her, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb, if my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as other men. Now it says there, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything. I'm going to tell you what I believe he saw, what she saw. She saw guilt all across his face. It wasn't a game anymore. Now he is mentioning the covenant God. He is referring to his Nazirite vow dedicated to Yahweh. That's the word he uses there for God. Dedicated to the God of the covenant. Now, keep in mind who he's talking to here. He's talking to Delilah, a Semitic name, which means that her father was probably Jewish. And she yet was being raised to worship Dagon. In other words, her father and mother were apostates. This woman did not love the covenant God. Her whole scheme centered around pleasing Dagon, which makes some ancient rabbis believe that Delilah was actually a sacred prostitute. That she was actually a part of the temple rite worships of Dagon. Now, Dagon was a fish god. That means picture a mermaid, but make it male. I've seen pictures of what they believe Dagon looked like. Well, one ugly dude, I got to tell you, one ugly dude. Here's this guy with a full head of hair, full beard, with the body of a fish. He looks absolutely ridiculous. But that was their god. She was more than likely a prostitute in that temple. So she's face to face with a guy who's saying, there's one true God in the universe, and that's Yahweh. And I have made a vow to him. This is the first time he says the truth about who he is. The first time in the story of Samson, except for Judges 15, which we talked about, the first time he gets down to the nitty-gritties. He finally declares his faith, something up to this point he had completely avoided. This was his statement of faith, but it smacked in the face of the way in which he had been conducting himself. It didn't make sense. And I believe what she saw on him was nothing short of guilt. I was set apart from my mother's womb to be raised as a Nazirite. No razor has ever touched my head because of the vow I've made to Yahweh. Now they're face to face with the conflict of the relationship from the very beginning. He had no business being with her. He had no business being with her. What fellowship does light have with darkness? Paul would tell us in Corinthians, what fellowship does light have with darkness? How can you, who call yourself children of the living God, align yourself with children of Belial? How are you unequally yoked together with an unbeliever? Darkness and light don't mix. What are you doing with this woman in the first place? I believe what she saw on his face was incredible guilt, but it was not enough guilt to repent of the sin that brought him to that point. Because there's one key phrase, you just can't gloss over it. Notice in verse 17, I hope maybe by now you've picked this up. When he tells her the truth, 2 words give away his heart. Yes, I'm guilty, but no, I won't repent. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and take the next step. What 2 words in verse 17 did you pick up? Anybody pick it up? The moment you shave my head, my strength will leave me. My strength. This is presumption. This is what I was talking to you about earlier. It's not your strength, buddy. Where did you get the idea that it's your strength? You think somehow this is magically wrapped up in your long golden curls? Or whatever color they might be, more than likely black? You think your head that now has 7 locks on it, you think that your strength is in those follicles? It's in what they represent. It's the Nazirite vow that you have made to Yahweh, the covenant God. And it is his strength that is in you, represented by those locks of hair. He doesn't get it. Even though he tells her the truth, he's guilt-ridden. He's crossed the line. You see, he wasn't even a Sunday morning Christian. You know, Sunday morning Christians, you're here. You've come. Samson wasn't even a Sunday morning Christian. He more than likely was living with Delilah out of wedlock. He didn't even come to the temple to worship, didn't even present himself. How long this went on, we don't know. Could have been years. He wasn't even a Sunday morning Christian because he had a serious, life-dominating sin that gripped his every thought. And that sin was sensual through and through, and it emanated right out of his eyes. There's no other way to put it. Samson had a lust problem. He would have lived on the computer today. He had a problem. All the way back at Timnah, through the prostitute, through all the killings that took place, through those moments where he showed spiritual strength, all the way to Delilah. Now he stands up, looks her square in the eye, and tells her the truth. Cut these babies off, and my strength will be gone. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, but it's not your strength. It's his strength. And up to this point, you've been relying on your strength. Look at verse 21. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. This is after she puts him to sleep on her lap. By the way, I wondered about how she did that. How did she put him to sleep on her lap? the worship of Dagon included sex potions, sleeping medications. More than likely, she drugged him. Samson was tied up, laid there like a baby wrapped in a light blanket. And Delilah knew that his strength was gone from him. So she called for the Philistines to subdue him. Can you imagine the expression on his face when he realized, listen, not that his strength was gone. I'm going to get a little more emotional for this one. Can you imagine the expression on his face when, if he was drugged, the drug wore off, he was now bald, and she saw him there, and he saw her there. Can you imagine what he must have thought when he realized this woman loved her God, Dagon, more than I loved my God, Yahweh? Can you imagine what he must have felt when he suddenly put two and two together? Can you see him as his eyes are being dimmed in the pain of a fiery poker? The Hebrew words there are that dug out his eyes. They didn't just put a fiery poker on his eyes. They dug them out. They removed the eyeballs so that he would never, ever, ever see again. As far as they were concerned, that was how Samson could be minimized. According to the Arabic version, they blinded him by putting fiery pokers into his eyes. And some of the Jews some of the rabbis around this passage observe that this was done in just retaliation, measure for measure. Samson, they say, went after his eyes, that is, by taking one harlot after another. Therefore, the Philistines put those eyes out in just retaliation. They brought him down to Gaza by the seacoast. He had been there before to his own shame. Remember, that's where he ripped the gates out. And he carried the gates out in that spirit of pride. After he had been with a woman he had no business being with, they took him back there, bound him with fetters of brass, literally meaning 2 balls and 2 chains. And there we see Samson on empty, in the deepest spiritual depression one can imagine, grinding like a common ox. The motions of mills of water or wind were yet to be invented, but it was usual, even today in some of the eastern countries, to grind with hand mills, at which 1 or more people would work. Usually it was something reserved for slave girls. In Gaza, there he is, full circle of sinful rebellion. That's where he started out with the harlot, and now he's relegated to slavery, grinding corn, the lowest and hardest form of slavery that there was. That is spiritual depression. That is functional depression. That is a picture of what it looks like when we continue with our life down patterns or down pathways where we've established bad patterns, sinful patterns. We come all the way over here. And you know what usually happens when we're all the way over here? We don't see this in Samson. In fact, we see just the opposite. But with most people, when they get over here and they're in this darkness, they look for somebody else to blame. Somebody else's fault. He did this to me. She did that to me. And they become victims. They're victims. Now, it's a sad place to be, and as Christians, we need to have all kinds of empathy to help people work their way back. Because you see, the solution, which we'll talk about next week, to spiritual depression, the restorative principles are that we begin to work our way back up that ladder, up that mountain, by making right choices along the way. Even, I've seen people, even as simple as, when you get up tomorrow morning, I want you to take a cool shower. That's how small steps some people need to walk. I mean, I've actually counseled people. When you get up tomorrow morning, the only thing I want you to do is take a cold shower. Make it cool. And even making that choice to take a cool shower, instead of just lying in bed all day, feeling like a victim, and gaining a victory as small as taking your leg out of the bed, moving toward the shower, turning the shower on, and pouring some cold water on you. Even if you end up back in bed, you've at least taken that first step. You've made a choice to move. I've seen people die by not moving. I watched them die. They just die. Life is gone. This process takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. That's why verse 22 is in the Bible. It says, "But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved." But, aren't you glad that is in the Bible? Aren't you glad God's vocabulary includes but? Can you sense the pulsating power of God's marvelous grace readying itself to emerge triumphant through this man who lost everything by making one bad moral choice after another? There's a difference, listen to me. There's a difference between failing forward and failing backward. When you fail backward, you lose hope. When you fail forward, there's always hope. There's always hope. Somehow or another, you get the impression as you're reading this story, Samson's going to come out okay. Well, he doesn't come out okay. He comes out dead. He ends up dead. There's no beauty in patterning your life after Samson. That's why the story's there. What gets him into the hall of faith is when his hair began to grow and he prayed that prayer. It's an awesome prayer. It's a prayer all of us need to learn how to pray. Lord, do it one more time. Just one more time. Give me that strength just one more time. And I got to tell you, friends, God always has a one more time. If you pray that prayer and say, okay, Lord, I've blown this. I have tremendous guilt over what I've done. But don't just be guilty, be repentant. Repentant means you take the guilt and you put it where it belongs, on the cross. And you come to the cross and you say, my guilt has been absorbed on that cross. All the sins I've ever committed and their guilt are on that cross. And so, Lord, even though I have failed you miserably, one more time, just do it one more time. Put me, as he says to the lad boy, put me between the two pillars of impossibility. And one more time, just one more time, give me your strength to justify the fact that you have loved me and gave your son for my sin on that cross.
This message by Dr. ChuckBetters was brought to you by Glasgow Church in Bear, Delaware. in conjunction with Mark Inc. Ministries. To order a copy of today's message, please contact Mark Inc. Ministries with the reference code at the bottom of this screen. You may also order other sermons and resources by contacting Mark Inc. Ministries at 877-MARK-INC or www.markinc.org. That's www.markinc.org.